Hi. Hello. My name is Stephanie and welcome, or if you're coming back, welcome back. Either way, I'm glad you're here and I hope you're well. And today we're talking about Born to be Bound by Addison Cain and Crave to Conquer by Zoe Ellis, the two books at the center of the infamous Omegaverse lawsuit and how James Cameron is to blame for it. I'm kidding about that last bit, but not as much as you'd think. Not as much as you'd think. This is a redo of a video I made back in 2020, so if it seems like you've seen this before, you might have. But before we get into all this, a couple things. Number one, I'm not a lawyer. I know jack all about the law, and none of this should be considered legal advice. And number two, hi mom. Don't watch this one. Love you so much. Also, spoilers for both the aforementioned lawsuit duology books, Born to be Bound by Addison Cain and Crave to Conquer by Zoe Ellis, as well as a massive content warning for essay, graphic violence, intimate partner violence, extremely dubious consent, and misogyny. Not going to be going into graphic detail of any of that, but it's a major part of both books, and I'm going to touch on some of it. So if you want to bow out of this one for your own well-being, I get it. Please do so, and I'll see you in the next one. All right, let's get into all this. Part 1, the Omegaverse. What the hell is it? So what the hell is the Omegaverse? I'm so glad and so sorry for you that you asked. The Omegaverse is a literary subgenre in which people are divided into a dominance hierarchy, more commonly called a pecking order. Basically, it's a rigid caste system that determines how people within that system interact with each other in sexual and romantic contexts. Again, mom, don't watch this one. For the most part, it varies on the work, but, for the most part, the Omegaverse follows the now defunct ideas about wolf pack structure presented by Rudolf Schenkel. Imagine explaining to him what he's doing being mentioned in this context. Sorry. Based on the research that he did on wolves in captivity, but his concepts don't really work for wolves in the wild, and like I said, they've since been now defunct. But basically, in an Omegaverse AU, people are divided into this hierarchy based on their biological traits. Characters will, again, this depends on the work, but for the most part, characters will often have two sexes, a main one that's decided by their sex organs, and a second one that usually manifests during puberty, which determines their place within the aforementioned hierarchy. Again, this isn't every Omegaverse work, but it's pretty standard fare in a lot of them. I've read so much Omegaverse fic, not only for this video that I'm doing now, but for the one back in 2020. It's so much Omegaverse. Not all Omegaverse works contain werewolves or the like, but people still have wolf-like behavior and physical traits. I'm going to do my best to keep this as family friendly as possible. Again, mom, if you made it this far, don't watch this one. At the top of the hierarchy are the alphas, who are usually portrayed as being physically larger and stronger with very dominant and aggressive personalities that can border on violent and controlling, and at worst, abusive and have, for family-friendly reasons, wolf-like anatomical features, and we're gonna leave it at that. Next in our hierarchy pyramid are the betas, and they are typically portrayed as being the closest to normal humans in an Omegaverse universe, and sometimes they have a combination of alpha and omega traits, but for the most part, they are just your standard regular human within these universes. Although sometimes they're left out of the world completely, depending on the work. Again, it varies. But usually, for the most part, they are just your average human caught up in all this sometimes. And at the very bottom of the pyramids, make your own joke, we have the Omegas, who are usually portrayed as being more submissive and sometimes physically smaller and often weaker than their alpha counterparts. Both alphas and Omegas go into ruts and heats respectively where they need to mate. Sometimes with the intention of reproduction, sometimes not. Again, it depends on the work. But when these things happen, they need to mate, which can lead to a host of consent issues, but we'll get into that when we start getting more into the actual content of both books. Now again, all this can vary from story to story and world to world and plot to plot, but those are the basics. Omegaverse 101, if you will. So, that's what the Omegaverse is. Where the hell did it come from? Part 2, the Omegaverse. Where the hell did it come from? So pieces of the Omegaverse have existed in fandom spaces for an incredibly long time. The mating and heat cycle tropes have their origin in the place where most fanfiction tropes begin. Star Trek, specifically the 1967 episode Amok Time, which featured Pon farr, the Vulcan mating cycle where Vulcan males have to mate or they die. This became an incredibly popular trope within the Star Trek fandom, especially among Kirk-Spock shippers. We owe the Star Trek fandom for so much. They so much. And I'm not even being facetious there. So much is owed to them. Nodding actually started showing up in fics in the 1990s, and it was popular in, you guessed it, the Star Trek fandom, specifically within the fandom for Star Trek The Next Generation. However, the Omegaverse as we know it began in the Supernatural fandom. But before we talk about Supernatural, we gotta talk about James Cameron and his show, Dark Angel. Dark Angel was a sci-fi series set in a dystopian Seattle and follows Max, played by Jessica Alba, who was a genetically modified super soldier living in hiding from a secret government agency after escaping a secret facility with her siblings, other genetically modified soldiers, as children. It ran for 2 seasons from 2001 to 2003, and from what I can remember, because I do have a vague recollection of watching it, it was a fun, kind of cyberpunk-esque show. It was a good time. And in Dark Angel, it was a canon thing that the genetically modified soldiers would go into heat. Heat was a canon thing that happened in the canon of the show. And who played one of the aforementioned genetically modified super soldiers? I'm so glad and so sorry you asked. It was Jensen Ackles. It was Jensen Ackles. Do you see where this is going? Don't worry if you don't. You will in just a second. On September 13th, 2005, television itself was invented and Supernatural started airing. And who starred in Supernatural? Oh, that's right, Jensen Ackles and Jared Padalecki. Meaning that because Jensen Ackles was in both shows, there was obviously going to be some fandom overlap. Now, because of the supernatural nature of Supernatural, werewolf and nodding fics were already pretty popular within it, and in 2010, an anonymous user posted a prompt on a kink meme prompt on LiveJournal for the J2 ship, the ship between the two actors. Listen, shipping in Supernatural has always been interesting, and before the appearance of Castiel, your shipping options were pretty limited to either shipping the two brothers or shipping the two actors. Now, due to the nature of the prompt, I'm simply going to put it on screen and you can pause to read it. It's a lot. The Dirtiest Sock ended up filling the prompt with the unfinished I Ain't No Lady But You'd Be a Tramp in July and August of 2010, that same year it was posted. Because of the popularity of the aforementioned werewolf and nodding fics within the fandom, I get psychic damage whenever I say the latter of those, the Omegaverse quickly took off within Supernatural and spread to other fandoms from there. A similar kink meme prompt was posted in November of 2010 and in January 2011, both of which use the Omegaverse terminology, alpha, beta, omega, knots that we're familiar with today, or if you weren't before, you are now. Again, due to the nature of said prompts, I'm simply going to put them on screen and you can pause to read them. Again, it's a lot. There's a lot going on here. The Omegaverse is an incredibly popular subgenre in both fanfiction and commercially published works. As of 2020, the most recent stats I could find, again, all relevant articles and anything else, screenshots are all going to be referenced below. There are almost 70,000 Omegaverse fics on AO3, and that was 4 years ago. And just on AO3, that's to say nothing of the literally thousands and thousands of results you get if you plug Omegaverse into Kindle Unlimited. So that's what the Omegaverse is and where it came from. So let's talk about the lawsuit. Part 3, Werewolf Erotica goes all the way to court, because we do in fact live in the strangest timeline. So back in 2016, Addison Kane published Born to be Bound, the first book in her Alpha's Claim series. She also wrote several other Omegaverse romance books independent of her Alpha's Claim series, but that's the main one we're going to be focusing on today. And she was extremely successful at it. She's a USA Today best-selling author, and according to one article, again, all relevant articles will be linked down below, she made almost $400,000 from her works. I'm in the wrong business. Flash forward a few years to January of 2018, and new author Zoe Ellis published Crave to Conquer, the first book in her own series, the Myth of the Omega series. In April of 2018, Kane and her publisher, Blushing Books Publication, filed copyright takedowns against Ellis to various retailers alleging that Ellis had plagiarized Kane's work using the DMCA, the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, which, to put it super duper simply, and again, I'm not a lawyer, I don't know anything about the law. To put things super duper simply, it is a copyright law here in the United States that was passed all the way back in 1998, which makes it illegal to duplicate digitally copyrighted works and sell them. Again, I'll have a link down below that explains things much more effectively and comprehensively than yours truly ever could, but that's the basics of it. And basically, Kane and her publisher alleged that Ellis had violated the DMCA and that Kane was the creator and therefore the owner of certain tropes that are often utilized within the Omegaverse genre. Put a pin in that. And it was effective. They actually got Ellis's books removed from Barnes & Noble and iTunes, which I don't have to tell you, those are two massive retailers, for 3 months. Eventually, Ellis and her publisher, Quill Inc. Books Limited, fought the claims and got her works restored. But again, it took 3 months where they were removed completely from these two massive retailers. In October 2018, Ellis and her publisher, Quill Inc. Books Limited, countersued Ellis and her publisher for defamation, interfering with Ellis's career, and filing false copyright claims and abusing the DMCA. They were sinking $1.25 million, that is million with an M, folks, in damages. Blushing Books, who was Kane's publisher, settled in 2019, stating that the DMCA claims were invalid and paid Ellis and her publisher at the time of filming, February 2024, an undisclosed settlement. Lindsay Ellis here on YouTube has 2 phenomenal videos that go into much greater detail about the lawsuit and all its just wild details that I highly recommend that you watch. But basically the case was dismissed with prejudice, which, despite what Kane herself might tell you, does not mean that she won. The claims against Ellis didn't have any merit, and they were undone, and Kane did not get to copyright the Omegaverse or any tropes there within. So let's talk about the books that took a supernatural kink meme prompt fill all the way to court. Part 4. These books dealt me psychic damage, and now I'm going to deal that damage to you too. Born to be Bound by Addison Kane is a post-apocalyptic story set in a distant future where a plague has wiped out most of humanity and the remaining people have moved into domed cities to isolate themselves from the dangerous outside world. And to give credit where it's due, I like the dome city idea. It's a cool bottle setting. Life within the domes is extremely hierarchical, with alphas at the very top as a ruling class, betas in service roles, and omegas kind of relegated to the arts. At least I think so. The world building, while fairly interesting, again to give credit where it's due, where there is any, and what there is extremely choppy and hard to follow. And I get that this is the first book in the series and that the world will slowly be built throughout. I'm not reading the rest of these, though, I'm going to be honest with you. And again, you don't want your first book to be all exposition, but at the same time, there does need to be something for you to build on. And the fact that it just switched POVs so suddenly with no paragraph headings or even paragraph breaks, just bam, suddenly a new POV mid-paragraph, kind of only adds to the confusion of things. Crave to Conquer by Zoe Ellis takes place in a fantasy-esque setting where all the Omegas have disappeared hundreds of years earlier. And every time a child presents as an Omega, they vanish without a trace, never to be seen or heard from again. Again, this usually happens like right around puberty, right, when this trait manifests. As a result, the population is dwindling and it's turning into a population crisis because alphas and betas can't reproduce with each other or among themselves. And again, to give credit where it's due, I like the concept of this one. The world building was interesting and I thought the mystery itself was intriguing. Both the alphas, Shepard in Born to be Bound and Droko in Crave to Conquer, are physically large and incredibly strong, have short tempers, and are prone to violent outbursts. They are both also incredibly cruel. Shepard was born and raised in the prison level of the Domed City, a harsh and violent place where only the strong survive and escape is virtually impossible. Now, eventually, he and a group of alpha criminals are able to climb out of the pit and take over the city, killing the ruling government and putting the city under siege. Does that maybe sound a little familiar to you? Like maybe you've seen that somewhere before? I bet it might. Put a pin in it. We're going to circle back to it. And once they take over, the Omegas are hunted down and forced into sex slavery, so those who haven't been captured or killed have gone completely underground. The problem is they are rapidly running out of food and supplies. Because of this, an Omega named Claire returns to the city to buy pills on the black market that are going to be used to help hide her Omega status, like masking her scent, so that she's able to go to the Citadel in the capital to plead with Shepard to have mercy on them so that she can get food for her fellow Omegas. Why she thought this was a good idea is beyond me, but sometimes for plot reasons, stuff doesn't always make a lot of sense, and we're just going to roll with it. Drogo in Crave to Conquer is a warlord who has recently conquered a kingdom and named himself king, as you do, I guess, once you take over a kingdom. And he is desperately searching for the missing Omegas because he, as a big, strong, conquering alpha, deserves a woman as a prize. Don't love that. And he has an army of alphas at his disposal, a massive and well-trained army at that. So the Omegas, who actually fled society hundreds of years ago due to the abuse they faced under the alphas, and have been in hiding thanks to their magic ever since, send a spy named Kaelin to the palace to undercover to find out just how much Drogo knows and how close he is to finding out where they are. And she uses that magic, the same magic that hides the Omegas from the Alphas, to hide her own Omega nature and her Omega scent. Now, both Claire and Kaelin's suppressants end up failing. Claire having been sold fake pills on the black market, and Kaelin because the spell on her gets broken accidentally when Drogo tries to use magic to find the Omegas, and they both end up going into heat. And both Shepard and Drogo take extreme advantage of this. Both Omegas are taken captive and repeatedly and graphically assaulted. This takes a particularly disgusting and vile turn in Crave to Conquer, where Drogo basically uses SA as an interrogation technique. It is absolutely vile, and it was probably one of the most difficult parts of the books to read. Both alphas forcibly bond with the Omegas by biting their necks and marking them. This is a common trope in Omegaverse stories, and then attempt to gaslight them into accepting them as their mate using scent marking and purring and things like that. Again, these are common Omegaverse tropes. And both Omegas begin to succumb to a kind of Stockholm syndrome and start nesting. But because this is the first book in both series, thankfully they are both able to escape. Claire by literally jumping off a building like the Omega girl boss she is, and Kaelin by getting her magic back and attacking and actually pretty seriously injuring Drogo, as she should. We love to see it. Claire ends up taking refuge with a beta soldier, and Kaelin gets kidnapped by the leader of a rival kingdom. Both books end with our alphas vowing to get their Omegas back because they are not people, but prizes to be won, and I wanted to walk into the sea. 5. Tropes and ownership. So, did Crave to Conquer actually copy Born to be Bound? Well, in my opinion, and according to a court of law, for what that's worth to you, no. As someone who made the grave mistake of reading both these books, I genuinely do not think so. Do with that opinion what you will. Both books utilize a lot of the same very common, emphasis on the words very common, tropes that are often, emphasis on the word often, used in Omegaverse stories. And I think that's the key here. A part of the reason I brought up AO3 earlier is to show just how popular of a genre the Omegaverse is. Hell, in the 3.5, 4 years, give or take, since I made my original video about all this, it's only gotten more and more popular. This is Pit Babe. It's a Thai TV show about an alpha race car driver and the fan he makes a family-friendly arrangement with. Again, we're keeping it family-friendly here. There's an Omegaverse TV show, okay? An Omegaverse TV show. You can watch an Omegaverse TV show, and it's prestige television. I said what I said, The Sopranos who? It's Pit Babe all the way. And this, you've probably seen this book at Target. I know I see it every time I go into one. This is Fake Mate by Lana Ferguson. It's a shifter fake dating novel. And this is Bride by Allie Hazelwood. Allie Hazelwood is probably one of the most popular authors out there right now. It comes out this month, February, and you guessed it, it's Omegaverse. You can buy Omegaverse novels at Target and watch it on TV. While I wouldn't go so far as to call the Omegaverse mainstream by any means, it is certainly much more well known and more accessible than it ever has been, which I think is both fun and sends me into an existential spiral, the duality of man and all that jazz. Basically, what I'm getting at is the Omegaverse is a popular genre, and as someone who again read a lot of fics in preparation for both these videos, what I've found is that regardless of the fandom, regardless of the pairing, a lot of Omegaverse stories utilize a lot of the same tropes. The ruts and heats, the use of suppressants, the mating bites, the purring, the nesting, the nodding, and hell, even the dubious consent issues are well established within the genre. These are very, very common tropes. Hell, close this out. Stop listening to me. Go open Goodreads or Barnes& Noble or Amazon or AO3 or Wattpad or Tumblr. Search Omegaverse. Pick one story or book at random and read the summary, and I guarantee you'll see at least one, if not multiple, of those tropes. Hell, Born to be Bound by Addison Kane actually began its life as Dark Knight Rises fan fiction. That's probably why the pit and the taking over the city stuff sounded so familiar. It's Dark Knight Rises fan fiction with serial numbers filed off. It's about Bane. And both Kane and Ellis created their stories and based their plots around extremely common tropes that exist within the genre they were writing. And here's the thing about tropes. No one owns them. Just like no one owns a genre. That would be like if I wrote a horror novel someday and tried to copyright the idea of a haunted house or a creepy doll. I don't own those things. Those are well-established tropes within the genre. No one owns them. No one owns tropes. And no one should be able to own tropes. And for what it's worth, a court of law seems to agree with me on that one. Part 6. The Omegaverse Lawsuit and You. And that brings us to the and you segment of today's video, during which I'm going to very much get up on my soapbox and simply say this. Stop binding and selling fan fiction. Just stop doing it. It's a crime. And if you have a Ko-fi or a Patreon, do not promote that on a fan fiction site, because it could be seen as trying to profit off your fic, which again is a crime. I shouldn't be able to open up Etsy and Mercari and see, like, the big Harry Potter fics bound and for sale. Stop doing it. It's a crime. Fan fiction exists in a kind of legal gray area because you're using characters, settings, and ideas that belong to someone else, yes, but you're using it to create something transformative, which is protected under fair use, as long as, and here's the key part, as long as you are not profiting from that work. Once you start profiting from it, it becomes copyright infringement, because no one but the copyright holder has the right to control how their creation is used and distributed. It doesn't happen very much anymore, but you can very much be sued for your fanfics. I've been on the internet a long time, probably too long that is healthy for a person, and in my life I have known three separate people who have gotten cease and desist letters from Anne Rice back in the LiveJournal and GeoCities days. That's how old I am for context. Anytime there is an exchange of money for fan fiction, it no longer falls under fair use, and it puts the entire fan fiction community in danger. I know that sounds kind of dramatic, and I am kind of dramatic, but yeah, it's a very real concern. If you want to learn bookbinding and do it yourself for your own use, rock on. It looks like a really, really cool hobby. Just don't sell it. Just don't sell it. Okay? Okay. In conclusion, James Cameron is partially responsible for the Omegaverse. Most fanfiction tropes can be traced back to Star Trek. We owe them so much for what they've done for fandom as a whole. Supernatural is truly an unhinged media experience. I'm not a lawyer, nor should you take legal advice from me. Don't abuse the DNCA. If you want to profit up your fic, you gotta file the serial numbers off. And while Born to be Bound and Crave to Conquer are both extremely trope-heavy stories within the genre, in my opinion, no one copied anyone, because no one owns tropes and no one should own them, and a court of law agrees with me for what that's all worth to you. Also, don't read these They're bad. There's probably better Omegaverse novels out there, but it ain't these two. Don't read them. They're bad. Thanks so much for listening to all that, and until next time, stay healthy, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next one. Apologies for the psychic damage, and goodbye.